The fuck going on with y'all, man, and welcome to the best endgame rogue build for Diablo 4, Twisting Blades. What you are currently watching is my level 80 rogue smashing tier 3 Nightmare Sigil dungeons. It's fast, it's fun to play, and deals tons of damage, especially against single targets. And to make sure you can successfully create a badass rogue like this, I have created an easy to follow guide on everything you need to know after you hit level 50 and enter World Tier 3. We're going to talk about the skill tree and the rogue specialization used for this build, gear, the stats to look for, and what legendary aspects to put on each piece, the Paragon board and the glyphs socketed per page, a simple progression guide to follow, and a few tips and tricks to help with your endgame Diablo 4 experience. So, without further ado, let's get it started. Skills. For each endgame guide that I'll be making, there will be two builds that we use throughout the progression progress. The first one is used early. This one is easier to use and most likely the build that you leveled with. Once you obtain some Paragon points and gear aspects, then you can respec into the second build. This one is a bit harder to use but does way more damage via Shadow Clone. Here's what your skill bar should look like for each build and the passives to go along with it. Now, I'm not going to explain each and every single skill point, but I will explain how and why we use each of our main active skills. Puncture is our basic skill. It is mainly used to regenerate energy and apply vulnerable to our enemies. Twisting Blades is our core skill. This is our main damage dealer. If you have the energy, then use this ability. However, I do want to note that this is a two-part skill. First, you impale an enemy with some blades, then, after a short amount of time, they will return to you. The return damage is the majority of our damage. Dash is our first mobility skill. This is used to reposition yourself for twisting blades or to get out of tough situations. Shadow Step is our other mobility skill, and I found myself using this ability to initiate fights on elites or bosses or to focus down inner sight targets. Poison Trap is definitely the odd one out of the pack, but is quite possibly the most important skill that we have, behind Twisting Blades of course. It obviously poisons anything it hits, but Enhanced Poison Trap also knocks down any and all enemies as well, excluding bosses. So, if you're surrounded by some dangerous mobs, throw down a Poison Trap and you should be just fine. The next defensive skill we use in these builds is Dark Shroud. Pretty self-explanatory here. It makes you more tanky and helps you move faster, so make sure this is always up. However, there are some builds out there that use some kind of imbuement skill instead of Dark Shroud to add more damage, which is totally viable by the way, but I found myself needing the extra damage reduction, so do whatever you feel is best for you. And finally, the last skill we use to eventually replace Puncture is Shadow Clone. This ability basically doubles your damage, while also making you unstoppable for a short amount of time. Pop this just before engaging and watch you and your Kagebunshin absolutely shred. To finish off the skills portion of this guide, let's quickly talk about the specialization and the key passive that we use. At the bottom of our skill tree we pick up Momentum. This gives us damage reduction, energy regeneration, and movement speed, and because this build has multiple ways to proc it, it's pretty much up all the time. The specialization that we use for this build is obviously Inner Sight. While you're fighting, you'll notice random enemies have a purple eye icon above their head. If you hit these marked enemies, eventually you'll gain an unlimited amount of energy for a short amount of time, which is insanely strong for this build because it allows us to spam Twisting Blades as much as we want, which is why this build shines against single targets. Alright, now that we've gone over the skills, the passives, and specialization, let's move on to gear. For each piece of gear, I'm going to show you what stats to look for, the aspects to imprint on them, and what gems to socket. So, let's start off with weapons. The main weapons that we'll be using with this build are one-handed swords. The reason why is because by default, they give critical strike damage, which is a very important damage stat for this build, along with vulnerable damage and core skill damage. The aspects that we imprint on our swords are Edge Masters, which has great synergy with Inner Sight, and Accelerating, which gives us an enormous amount of attack speed. The Edge Masters aspect can be obtained by completing the Old Stones dungeon in the Scots Glen region, while the Accelerating aspect must be extracted from a legendary piece of gear. For our offhand, we want to use crossbows because of their vulnerable damage implicit modifier. We don't really care about the DPS though, because it's mainly used as a stat stick for vulnerable damage, critical strike damage, and again, core skill damage. The aspect to put on our crossbows is Blade Dancers, which is the staple of this build. You can get this by finishing the Jalal's Vigil dungeon in the Skos Glen region. For sockets on our weapons, we want to use Royal Emeralds for more critical strike damage. Now, let's move on to armor. For our helm, we want cooldown reduction, maximum life, and total armor percentage. The aspect to imprint is Shared Misery to give us crowd control proliferation. The more crowd control, the better. You can get this aspect by doing the Oblivion dungeon in the Hawazar region. For chests, we want damage reduction from close enemies, and damage reduction from poisoned enemies. Basically any type of damage reduction. And for even more survivability, we use the Disobedience aspect, which lets us stack an insane amount of armor. To obtain this aspect, you must complete the Halls of the Damned dungeon in the Kyrgyzstan region. For gloves, we're looking for additional ranks to Twisting Blades, critical strike chance, and attack speed. These stats are not as common as other ones, so we want to make sure we get them where we can. The aspect we imprint on our gloves is Manglers, giving us a high chance to daze enemies, adding yet another type of crowd control. Unfortunately, the only way to get this aspect is to find it on a legendary piece of gear and extract it. For pants, we look for the same stats as our chest, damage reduction. We even use a similar type of defensive aspect, Cheats, which also gives us movement speed. You can obtain this aspect by completing the Luban's Rest dungeon in the Skos Glen region. For boots, we're looking for movement speed, energy cost reduction, and any type of damage reduction. The aspect to imprint on boots is Ghost Walkers, which has good synergy with Shadow Clone. And you can get this by doing the Broken Bulwark dungeon in the Skos Glen region. And finally, for sockets on armor, we use Royal Topaz for even some more damage reduction. Now that we've talked about the weapons and armor used for this build, let's talk about the jewelry next. For amulets, we're looking for movement speed, cooldown reduction, and any type of damage reduction. The aspect to use on them is Blast Trappers, helping us with another option to apply Vulnerable. You can obtain this aspect by finishing the Korvalar Ramparts dungeon in the Fractured Peaks region. And for rings, we're looking for critical strike chance, critical strike damage, and vulnerable damage. These stats will tremendously increase our already potent offense. The aspects to imprint on our rings are Smiting, which gives us more damage and crowd control, and Umbral, to help us generate some more energy. To get the Smiting aspect, you have to extract it from a legendary piece of gear. To get the Umbral aspect, you must complete the Champion's Demise dungeon in the Dry Steppes region. However, this aspect is much more useful if you find a higher roll of it on a random legendary ring, so keep your eyes peeled. For sockets on jewelry, we use Royal Skulls to give us more armor. Now I know what you're thinking. What about some uniques? Well, it just so happens that there are a few uniques that would work really well for this build. Here they are. The unique sword Doombringer adds a little bit of extra damage for clear speed and some damage reduction. The unique helm Harlequin Crest gives us damage reduction and +4 to all skills, which is absolutely insane for any build. And lastly, the unique boots Penitent Greaves leaves a trail of frost wherever you walk, chilling any enemies inside of it and or near us. Okay, that wraps up the gear portion of this guide. Now let's move on to the Paragon system, which is arguably the most powerful part of any build. Every time you level up after 50, you are rewarded with some Paragon points. In this guide, I'm going to show you how to spend those Paragon points, what boards to use, and what glyphs to put in each socket. Here we go. On the starting Paragon board, we pick up the rare node, Prime, then get the socket to put the closer glyph inside, increasing our Twisting Blades damage and giving us a little bit of damage reduction. After that, go ahead and put points in the rare nodes, Lawless and Skillful. On the second board, make sure the legendary node, Deadly Ambush, is facing downwards, giving us easy access to it. Deadly Ambush gives us a good amount of critical strike damage, and make sure to pick up Trapper along the way. Move towards the socket, where we are going to use the Diminished Glyph, boosting the effects of the nearest rare nodes, which are Engineering and Cunning. Before moving to the right, to the third board, don't forget to pick up another rare node, Spring Loaded. Once you're on the third board, again, make sure the legendary node is facing towards the entrance. On your way to Cheap Shot, grab Safeguard. Cheap Shot increases our damage to crowd-controlled enemies, which is basically all the time. After this, head immediately towards the socket and put the Control Glyph, which, like Cheap Shot, gives us more damage to crowd-controlled enemies. It also synergizes really well with our unique boots, Penitent Greaves. Before heading south to the 4th board, go ahead and pick up the rare nodes Wiles and Devious. Now, unlike the previous boards, you want to rotate this one so the socket is closest to the entrance. The reason why is because we want to use our best glyph exploit as fast as possible. This glyph gives us vulnerable damage and is the most reliable way to apply vulnerable. Trust me, as soon as you get this, you will notice the difference. And of course, before we move on to the next board, make sure to pick up the rare nodes Training and Knowledge. To reach the 5th Paragon board, we actually go back to the 3rd one, but instead, path to the right side. For this one, we want to rotate it so that the socket is on the top left. Put points towards the socket and put in a turf glyph, giving us damage and damage reduction. Then pick up the rare nodes Lawless and Finisher. Our 6th and final Paragon board, rotate it so that the socket is on the bottom left. Once you get enough points to get there, put in the combat glyph, which increases our core skill damage and even gives us a little bit of energy generation. After that, finish it off with the rare nodes Dosage and Artifice. As far as the remaining 20-ish Paragon points, go ahead and put them wherever you like. At this point, you should be doing godly levels of damage anyway. For each Paragon board, every time you get a socket node and input a glyph in there, be sure to meet that glyph's requirement as soon as possible, because those additional bonuses are very strong, especially when you put them together. These glyphs have their own experience bar and can be leveled up via Nightmare Sigil dungeons. At level 15, the radius increases, giving us the ability to make them even stronger. This is the order that I would level each glyph to 15, from most important to least important. Alright, now that we've talked about the skills, the gear, and the Paragonies, let's see how we're going to use all this knowledge to progress our character. First of all, if you have your own way of progression that you like, then by all means do whatever you find fun in this game. What class you play, what build you use, how you want to level up, etc. At the end of the day, it's all just preference, man. But if you do want a template to go off of, to give you a little guidance, then here is what I would recommend to do after you hit level 50 and unlock World Tier 3. The first thing you want to do is go and grab all your legendary aspects that are obtainable through dungeons. You want to have these available as soon as possible, so once you start obtaining good sacred gear, you can imprint it with the corresponding aspect immediately. Once you've got all your aspects, and this is your first character, then start farming to get Renown 5 in all regions. The reason why is mainly because of the extra skill points and extra Paragon points. Here's how I did it. I got all the waypoints, did all the strongholds, touched all the altars, completed all the dungeons, and even did a few side quests here and there, just to get that extra little bit of renown that I needed. Now, this will take a while, but remember, you only have to do this once per season, as all your other characters in that realm will receive the same buffs. Now, once you have obtained Renown 5 in all regions, first of all, salute to you for your hard work. The next thing you want to do is to get a full set of sacred gear with at least 2 out of 3 of the stats that we talked about earlier. Once you find a good piece of gear, upgrade it no more than 4 times, and then imprint the legendary aspect on it at the Codex of Power. After obtaining a full set of sacred gear, go ahead and level up to 70, however which way you want to. The absolute fastest way that I've experienced doing this is doing the same dungeon over and over again. But that honestly gets boring really fast, so feel free to do any world events, Hell Tides, Nightmare Sigils, or Tree of Whisper objectives. I would suggest doing Hell Tides every now and then, because that is the best way to get Forgotten Souls, which is the material you need to make your gear godlike. Once you reach level 70, you're going to complete the Capstone dungeon to unlock World Tier 4. You can definitely do this earlier, but you can't wear ancestral gear until level 70 anyway, so I would just wait. Which brings me to my next point. Once you get to World Tier 4, the first thing you want to do is get a full set of ancestral gear. However, this time, once you find a good piece of gear, you can upgrade it 5 times, maxing it out, and then enchant one of the stats to turn it into something you like better, and then put the highest rolled legendary aspect that you have on that piece of gear. You should be around level 80 at this point, so now it's time to start crafting Nightmare Sigils 50 to 54 levels under you to start upgrading your glyphs. And once each glyph is level 15, along with your full set of ancestral gear, you should be destroying everything and anything that you come across. Seriously, at this point, you're a fucking god. And to help you even further to reach this god status, let's move on to the last part of the guide. Tips and tricks. The first thing that I'd recommend using is the interactive map. This map literally shows where everything is in the open world of Diablo 4. Waypoints, dungeons, altars, etc. It's especially useful when you're trying to farm Renown 5 in all the regions. I'll go ahead and link it in the description down below. And while you're doing your thing around the open world, leveling up and whatnot, make sure you're upgrading your potion every 10 levels or so. You're going to need it for the extra bit of survivability. You can do this at the Alchemist, which can be found in most main towns. Another thing you could do at the Alchemist is craft elixirs, and at this point you should have a bunch just sitting in your inventory. Go ahead and use them as much as you want. In fact, I would keep one active at all times, mostly for the XP boost. One thing you definitely want to do every now and then are Hell Tides. If you want to gear up as fast as possible, this is the best way to do it. But not only that, there are 2 hidden mystery chests per Hell Tide, and these give the most loot, including Forgotten Souls, which is probably the most important material in the game. And, lucky for you, there is a handy dandy website that I've been using to track Hell Tides in these mystery chests. I'll go ahead and link that in the description as well. And as you're getting more and more loot, make sure you are keeping high rolls of the legendary aspects you want to use. Over time, you'll find better and better pieces of gear with the stats that you want. So you want to make sure you have well-rolled aspects just in case to imprint on them. But like most RPG games, you will mostly come across gear that just sucks. The best thing to do with this bad gear is to sell it to the vendor. Making your gear perfect starts to become extremely expensive, especially when it comes to enchanting. And a good way to balance this is to sell all the rares you find that you don't want to use, and salvage all the legendaries / uniques that you find that you don't want to use. The last thing that we should talk about is combos. There are definitely multiple ways you can engage fights and kill mobs, but this is the general combo I would use when approaching an elite or a boss. First, you want to pop Shadow Clone because it copies everything you do. Then, activate Dark Shroud for that damage reduction. Initiate on your target with Shadow Step, stunning them. Quickly put down a Poison Trap to knock down all the enemies around you. And now it's time to start spamming Twisting Blades as much as you can. And if you're focusing down inner sight targets, then you should be able to do this quite a bit. Then, use your dash charges to position yourself better for optimal damage and or to get out of tight situations. And there we have it, y'all. The best endgame rogue build for Diablo 4. And hey, if you guys enjoyed the video and found any parts of it useful, then I'm super glad. I plan to make this same type of video for all the other classes as well, with Sorcerer being the next one I make, along with many other builds that I plan to explore in this game. So, if you're interested in anything Diablo 4, throw me a sub, won't you? Other than that, thank you so much for watching. I truly appreciate it. And remember to stay a while and listen. Peace out.